a guest speaker here today, John Stapleton, who's going to be talking about the welfarization of disability. But I want to tell you a bit about John first. John Stapleton worked for the Ontario government in the Ministry of Community and Social Services and its predecessors, that's the word, for 28 years in the area of social assistance policy and operations. During his career, John was the senior policy advisor to the Social Assistance Review Committee and the Minister's Advisory Group on new legislation. His more recent government work concerned the implementation of the National Child Benefit. He is a commissioner with the Ontario Soldiers' Aid Commission and is a volunteer with St. Christopher House and Wood Green Community Services of Toronto. John was research director for the task force on modernizing income security for working age adults in Toronto. John has published op-eds in the Globe and Mail, National Post, and the Toronto Star. He has written reviews for the Literary Review of Canada and written articles and studies for Ideas That Matter, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the C.D. Howe Institute, the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation, and the Caledon Institute. John serves on the board of directors of the Daily Bread Food Bank. So as you can see, our guest today brings quite a bit of life experience and interesting work that he's put into this whole area that he'll be presenting today. Let's welcome John.
Thanks very much. I always had this life ambition, sort of a fantasy, that somebody would write down every word that I have to say. And here it's going to happen for some brief moments. It's going to happen here today. I should tell you, I should first of all ask you the question, what's the definition of an expert? Well, the definition is somebody from out of town with slides. And since I speak in Toronto an awful lot, I don't get to use that joke. Now, also looking around, I see a number of men. Most don't have ties. I'm glad that I have some men down here close by, because when you retire from government service, it's hard to give up your tie. And so I'm in a 12-step program to get rid of my tie. And as you can see today, I had a relapse. I'm just going to run through what I call sort of a systems approach to disability income programs. And I'm going to start out with, though, this is a question that you'll be able to answer, trivia questions at parties. So when someone asks you the question, how much money is spent on the whole income security system in Canada? And I wanted to start with this because then we're going to get to the disability income programs fairly quickly. But in 2009 and 2010, the amount of money that was spent in the whole income security system was $142 billion. Now that's from all levels of government, and you can be safely assured that this year it'll be over $150 billion. Now that means that the amount of income that comes from all those programs is about 10% of our economy. We use an expression called GDP, which is gross domestic product, and these programs make up about 10% of our overall GDP. So you see every program here at every source. You can see that there's CPP, there's EI, there's old age security, child benefits, social assistance, GST credits, workers' compensation, local programs of various sorts. And so that's the whole of our system that spends that amount of money from all parts of the government. That's municipal, local governments, that's the federal government, the provincial government. That's all the money that you put into. The sources are many and varied. The money that goes through EI and CPP from paychecks, from income tax, etc., is all in there. So now I want to go ahead and talk about, we're going to talk about the disability programs. And for those of you who are making notes, that the disability programs are about 20% of that overall income security system. So they just spend just a little bit short of $30 billion in terms of all the different income programs. So let's look at some facts. Social assistance disability income costs in Ontario are going up very fast, increasing overall in the rest of Canada. That's no secret. The fastest rising programs that we have in Canada in the disability income area are our social assistance programs, and that's why I called it, as Paul said, the welfarization of disability programs. In other words, they're making up a larger and larger portion of disability income programs. And many factors explain this. The aging of society. In 1967, the median age for a Canadian was 26. Today, the median age for a Canadian is 42. So if Canada's looking a little bit older to you, it actually is true. And so that's part of there's a factor there. Medicine and care. There's many, when you went back 20, 30 years, you didn't get those questions on the TV commercial. Talk to your doctor, ask your doctor about all the different types of medicines. So we have a number of different medicines, and we have, and this is increasing, and so we have a proliferation of the diagnoses of various types of disabilities as well as those disabilities themselves. People with disabilities are living longer. That's just another fact. And of course, when we look at Mr. Harper's proposal to take old age security from age 65 to 67, that will add another 50,000 people in Canada to our social assistance system, just in that one move alone. So we start to see how some other of the programs that we have are receding, and how some of our income assistance programs, including programs for people with disabilities, are also going to increase because those programs are not going to do as much as time goes on. We also see increasing poverty, and most people over the last year will be aware that we had this Occupy movement because of the amount of inequality that we see in society. And so that's another reason. And then, of course, we have issues of difficulty in accessing the workplace. Most of the new jobs that we've created over the last 10 years have come in what's sometimes called the creative class, like the good jobs. But an awful lot of jobs have been created in service industries. And service industries often require an awful lot of physical activity and physical capacity and abilities. And because of that, there's been greater difficulty in accessing the workplace. Now, I have an anecdote here, and really what's part of what started me into this work, and that was my 89-year-old mother. I was doing Meals on Wheels with her at Wood Green Community Center, and she says, you're supposed to be smart about these programs. I have a friend, she's on disability, and she thinks she's getting the wrong amount. And I said, well, I'd have to know what disability program she's on. And she said, oh, there you go, complicating things again. And so it got me to thinking, she assumed that there was a coherent system out there of disability programs because she didn't really face them. And of course, what happened is that she realized that, so it got me to thinking about how many programs are there actually, and there's actually 8 different disability, not disability income programs, but disability income systems in Canada. We have EI sickness, CPP disability, veterans programs, private plans, workers' compensation, social assistance, disability tax credits, DTC, and now we have a new one called the RDSP. So we have 8 disability income systems. So I wasn't smart enough that day to say, which of the 8 are you talking about? I had to actually think about it and build up an inventory of them. So here's an interesting point that when 5 of 8 of those programs, 5 of them, are only available to people who have engaged in regular salaried or wage-paid work. So, you have to work, so it has to be a later onset disability that you get, and it has to be a disability that you only get after you have worked in the labor force and you were salaried or a wage-paid worker. Well, one thing I'm here to tell you today is that not as many people get those good wage-paid and salaried work. What they often get is short-term contracts. And what they get is occasional work, or they get work that's through self-employment, and they don't get the regular check that they used to get years ago. And so as a result, these 5 programs, let's just review them again: EI sickness, CPPD, workers' compensation, veterans programs. And I mentioned veterans because veterans programs are much larger than most people think. And private plans with companies most often do not provide benefits to people with irregular or contract employment. So in other words, those programs are receding a bit, while disability income programs like social assistance and what we normally think of a welfare-based program have actually been increasing in size. So here's the answer. Social assistance in Canada for persons with disabilities comprise 29.4, let's just say 30%, of the expenditures in 2009 and 10, and for my home province, 4.1 billion was spent on ODSP, and so it's up to 1/3 of all the programs. So you got 8 programs, and 1 program makes up 1/3 of all the expenditures. And the incidence of irregular part-time and contract work is higher in Ontario. So we have to ask the question, are these other programs that are work-based, are they receding because the rules are changing or the benefits aren't as good? Or are they changing because they don't have as many people who are actually able to access them? And that's part of the work that I'm doing now with Lori and others who are part of the Social Science and Humanities Research Council grant here. So it's very important that you understand that we have the answer. We know that the social assistance-based programs are increasing in size. We're now working back to the question, and the question is why. So, here's 2008, 2009. I'm going to skip that one and go to the 2009 and 10. So what is the size of these programs? Well, you can see that social assistance here, the disability component, is 8 to 9 billion out of 28. So that's the 29% we talked about. You can see veterans and disability pensions award is 2 billion. EI sickness is not even half the size of the veterans programs, or right about the same size. CPPD and QPPD are 4.3 billion. The DTC is 2 billion. The private programs are actually quite large. You know, it's about 1/5 or a little over 1/5 of the total money paid out. And workers' compensation is 5.5. But look at the biggest one of all, is the social assistance disability component. I'm telling you here in this room that this is new. If you looked back at this 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been the largest program, but it's the largest program now. In Ontario, it's $12.4 billion. And I'm going to show you a series of slides where you see what it's like in Manitoba, where you see what it's like in BC, Alberta. But what you find is that the mix of these programs are different in different provinces. It is not uniform. So let's look at that. For example, First Nations programs in Ontario, people who are First Nations get ODSP, so the separate part is very, very small. You'll see when we get to Manitoba that it's much, much larger. You can also see that the ODSP portion is up to 33% of this overall, and that's much higher than other provinces, and I'll have something to say about that in a second. In Manitoba, you can see that the shares of the different programs of those 8 programs, and I haven't put RDSP in here because at this point it's just too small, it's just a developing program. And it spends about $1 billion all across Canada. So you can see that the various different programs take up, you know, sort of kind of equal shares when we look around. But if you see that the provincial social assistance for disabilities is at 177 million, but a much larger First Nations social assistance for disability component that you'll find in other provinces. And that's something that we're just going through now to figure out exactly how we should record that. When we look at Alberta, we have this very large program called AISH. Now, who has heard about AISH? Because AISH has been in the news lately, and AISH has been in the news because the Premier gave a $400 a month increase to AISH. And now AISH is higher than old age security and GIS put together. So that's sort of a good news, bad news thing, because the Alberta program, although it's the most generous in Canada, it's got the toughest disability definition. You have to be very severely handicapped to the point of unemployability before you can get access to that program. So we look at British Columbia, it's different again. Private disability insurance and income assistance for persons with disabilities are high portions of the program, but not as large. For example, the income assistance portion is larger for all of Canada and larger for Ontario. The private disability insurance is larger than the income assistance portion. So we're not living in a uniform Canada. So those are just some of the things that are going on in different provinces. Now, I'm not even going to start to explain this. This is one of these take-home slides that tells you what happened back in 2005 and 2006. But what's notable is you see that real tall part here for Ontario. Now, I have something to say about that in a couple of seconds. Moving on to 2009, 2010, again, you see the big increases happening in Ontario for the social assistance for people with disabilities. And as I said, I'm going to have a couple of things to say about that in a moment. And AISH, of course, as a standalone program right here, has had major increases, and it is about to have even greater increases as we go along. Increases in program expenditures over that 5-year period. You can see that the largest single increase is in the AISH program. And it starts to tell us a little bit about our federal system and the fact that Alberta is a much richer province. And are we going to start to see very different amounts of income and different amounts of services that are available because you live in a resource-rich province versus a province that is not? These are some of the things that we're going to have to talk about as Canadians and see what sort of uniformity or what level of diversity in payments we're, as citizens of the country that we're going to wish to tolerate. All very important questions. The one issue that remains unexplored is the extent to which some social assistance disability income programs are doing more of the heavy lifting. In other words, is social assistance having to do more than other programs because the other programs are receding because of the labor market? And that is with more irregular, contractual, and part-time work. Are those 5 disability programs, the ones that you can only get if you work, are those systems doing less? So in other words, did they get tougher, or did they just have fewer people to work with? And those are some of the research questions we're going to be getting at. And put another way, are they increasing along with ODSP, which is the Ontario program, and other provincial and territorial social assistance programs? And so some of the following charts tell that story. And what you see is, even though we've had a short-term blip up in EI sickness, which is this percentage here in a very small program, it's social assistance and private disability insurance that have been having the big increases across Canada, and social assistance for persons with disabilities. And you can see that it excludes here, it excludes the AISH program, because the AISH program is in some ways a social assistance program and is in some ways a disability income program. But if we were to include them, we would have the largest and the fastest growing part of the disability income system would be in the social assistance area. So that's something we know, and we have to start thinking, is that a good thing? Is the welfarization of disability programs a good thing, or should some of those other programs be doing more? Or should we be recognizing that our labor market is changing in very fundamental ways, and we need those other programs to change with it? These are some of the questions that we raised. So when we look at, if we look at social assistance for persons with disabilities, and this time we include First Nations social assistance and the Alberta program, we can see that that's growing at 24.2% over the period of 2005 to 2010. But when we look at the total, it's only 19.7%, and if we exclude social assistance, the growth rate is 17.9%. So once again, we can prove, we can say with great certainty that social assistance programs are growing faster. We do have the answer. We are now working back to the question, and that is why. In Ontario, it's very, very stark. You can see that the change in ODSP is much, much greater than in any other program. That's this figure here. And you can see in Ontario, it's much starker. The rate of growth is on the left-hand side there is much more so than the total, and when you exclude it, it's much less. When we look at Manitoba, we get a different picture. We can see that First Nations social assistance for the persons with disabilities is growing, and provincial social assistance for persons with disabilities is not growing quite as fast. But when we put the two together, that Manitoba starts to look like the other provinces like BC, Ontario, and Alberta. So if we exclude it, it looks like Manitoba, that the other programs are going faster, but when we include it, it looks like the other provinces. Alberta, look at the AISH program. It's growing faster than any other component. And we look at Alberta, the assured income for severely handicapped, AISH, is growing at a rate of 52%, and that was before the big $400 a month increase. So you can see what we're going to see in that program over the next while. British Columbia, again, income assistance for persons with disabilities is growing at the fastest rate. And we can see that when we look at income assistance for persons with disabilities, it's 27%. When we exclude it, it's 15.6%. Again, so we're looking at several different provinces here, and we're saying, even though the amounts are different, we're seeing the same phenomenon. Change in the caseload, we can see that Ontario is going up, and we can see Alberta and BC is going up. What we see is when we have programs in social assistance that are distinct programs with very, very different rules, what we see is higher increases in those programs. And you can see that in the spending, we see the same sort of thing. Ontario, ODSP, Alberta's income, the AISH program, and the BC program. If you have a separate program for persons with disabilities, that's where you see most of the growth. And we see it here too when we look at 2005 to 2010, 11. And for those of you who are saying right now, enough already with the graphs, these are the ones that you can take home with you and study. So, we know we've gone from 28% to 29%, and Ontario has gone up to 1/3 of social assistance in its comparison to disability programs. So what? So some of the questions that we have is, first of all, are work-triggered disability income programs, those ones that you can only get when you work, are they pulling their weight? Are they excluding non-regular employment? Well, of course they are. If you're working for a contract, and the company is contracted with you, if you're at self-employment, you're not necessarily paying into those programs, and nobody's paying in on your behalf. So why are they increasing so much more slowly than social assistance, and are social assistance disability programs getting a bad rap for the wrong reasons? In other words, many people say they're growing because you know, the rules are too easy, and that people are going on to these programs when they perhaps shouldn't be going on to them. But at the same time, we know that the other programs that were normally there, part of our safety net, have reduced in terms of their coverage. And is the slow drift to social assistance as the dominant income program, the dominant income system for persons with disability, is that a good thing? Is it good policy? We're not really discussing that. This is something that's happened, but we haven't had the policy discussion out ahead of it. In other words, we didn't say 10 years ago, here's something that we know is going to happen, and now we're going to have a discussion about it to see if it's the right thing to do. No, it happened under our noses, and now we have to think about something that's already happened and whether that's a good thing. So does it represent policy by trend and labor force characteristics, or does it represent something else? So we know those programs are not covering people the way they did before. I like to use the example of a woman who worked, say, in cleaning offices going back 40 years ago. She would have worked for the company, and if she had been injured and suffered a disability on the job, she would have been able to get EI sickness, then she would have been able to get workers' compensation, she would have had money and support from a company plan, and then she possibly would have got workers' compensation. So you got workers' compensation, company plan, EI sickness, and CPPD. If that same woman today is going into a building under a contract with a cleaning company, she gets no workers' comp, she gets no EI sickness, she gets no CPPD, and she gets no disability income plan from the company, because the company is the contractor, not the business where she's working. So that's important. So what are some of the facts? Who is getting benefits from social assistance disability income programs? What are the trends and overlap with other programs? Who benefits from these programs? And will the current trends we see now continue? Will they accelerate? Will they decelerate? Why and why not? So I'll give you something, a rogues gallery of some of the other answers that people have. So my answer coming out, my hypothesis is because the work-triggered programs are not doing as much as they did before, especially CPBT and especially workers' compensation programs. But one is that the neoconservative take, that maybe that some people are work shy and may not be diligent in retaining work where benefits are in place. You can all boo if you want to. Another take is that with disability benefits on ODSP, and I use the Ontario example here, they're 78% higher than Ontario Works, which is the welfare program, the basic program. Persons who don't believe they have a reasonable opportunity to work because they're living in destitution may attempt to marshal their existing impediments in such a way as to obtain disability benefits, and such persons also avoid stigma. So in other words, if they are on basic assistance and they can't make ends meet and they're in destitution, they're much more likely to suffer a disability and then have to go on to the longer term program. Another issue might be lack of knowledge, lack of information about programming and rights of an employee, and there's some evidence to say this is true. And this is connected to the criticism that people could work for an agency and never know about their rights and benefits and never seek them out. And often that happens to contract employees. So that's another part of it. Job security, the deterioration of the traditional employment. And there's also the whole issue of the recession. And the recession was particularly difficult for people with disabilities. An awful lot of people lost their jobs during the recession, but people who lost the most tended to be those who had had the most difficulty staying in the labor force, and often that was people with disabilities. And so what we see now is that we see programs like workers' comp and other programs that wouldn't necessarily support people in those positions, because when you have new employees come in, they don't qualify for many of the programs in the same way as people who are there for a long time. And certainly that was true of EI and workers' comp. Time limits. There's whole issues that relate to workers' compensation. And just to make a long story short here in these slides, I'll just say there's situations where the duty to re-employ somebody and the duty to make sure that somebody who gets workers' compensation is going to get back on the job. You often have situations where an employer has an obligation to re-employ a person with disabilities who's been a worker, but only has to do so for a 2-year period and then says goodbye to them. And that point at which they say goodbye is the point at which person comes on to income assistance. And we have some evidence to show that I believe it was in BC, that 30% of the flow onto provincial disability benefit programs are people who used to be receiving workers' compensation benefits. And we look at the increase in workers' compensation benefit, it's not even half of what it is in social assistance. So again, we have good empirical, good evidence for that. So that's the whole issue of people being deemed employable once all the avenues are exhausted. So again, that's part of it. Why would people be coming on to income assistance?
John?
Yep. A couple more minutes. Experience rating. There's been talk, and there's some penalties with workers' compensation, again, with experience rating, and those firms that are what are thought of sometimes as the bad actors for where people get more and more injuries on the job, then that becomes an issue too, where workers' compensation would be lessened in those situations. So, how are we going to find out how much of this is true and how much of these various hypotheses, what weight they all hold? And that's where we're doing our research. And we have one called the LAD, which is the Longitudinal Adjustment database that the federal government has, that Statistics Canada has. And it's a 20% sample of Canadians, and it tells us who's in the labor force. Then we have something called the SLID. Everybody familiar with the SLID? The SLID Survey of Labor and Income Dynamics. And what SLID will do is tell us, it has a self-reporting of people with disabilities. What it does not do is tell us whether they got that disability through the workplace. And then, rest in peace. PALS.
Oh, yeah.
We don't have the participation activity labor force survey. And that's a real tragedy that we're not going to have PALS anymore. But again, we can look back to PALS because we had it in 2006. And really what we're talking about here is jigsawing a bunch of imperfect data sources together to try and get these answers. So StatsCan did on disability expenditures, no single source, but a few sources together could help. LAD does have some data. Not possible to identify EI sickness though, only EI itself. LAD can trace persons with disabilities over time to explore duration and use of disability deductions and credits, so that'll give us part of the clue. And there are no veterans' pensions on tax data or on SLID, so we have to go directly to the veterans programs to get that. So, is welfarization, is it a good thing or a bad thing? So the pro is that social assistance allows a recipient to work and receive benefits. There's no automatic cutoff, like some other programs. It's not time limited, like some other programs. And ancillary benefits are often quite good. In other words, the various supports and services that you get with social assistance are sometimes far better than some of the other work-related programs. But the con is that you get low rates, you have stigma, social assistance deducts other income sources so they don't stack, and there's low asset limits, and they are very closely managed, like monthly reconciliation of income, which of course can cause lots of overpayments and problems in people planning their income. So I guess one of the answers for the future, I guess, would be to take the best of both worlds, try and see the best things that are in the social assistance programs and marry them together with what's best in the other programs. But again, this is all about starting to ask the question, when we already know what the answer is, that these programs are increasing. So now let's really get to the nitty-gritty and really start talking about these programs and talk about what we want as the future for disability income benefits in Canada. Thanks very much for listening.